The front door slammed so hard the glass panel beside it shuddered in its frame. "Get her off the property." My brother Caleb's voice came from somewhere inside the hallway, and it had the particular flatness of someone giving an instruction they had rehearsed. The locksmith kneeling at the door didn't look up. He kept working. The old brass lock my mother had used for 27 years came free in his hands while I stood on the wet porch watching it happen. My overnight bag hit the concrete beside me. I hadn't put it down. Someone had set it there. Half the contents had spilled when it landed, and my clothes were absorbing the rain in slow, quiet patches. 3 hours earlier, we had buried our mother. The funeral flowers were still in the back seat of my car. I could smell them from the porch. Caleb stepped into the doorway holding a folded document. He held it out like a man presenting evidence at a trial he had already won. "Mom left me the house," he said. Behind me, I heard my aunt make a small sound. Not words. Just a soft intake of breath that meant she had seen something she didn't know how to hold. Through the open doorway, past Caleb's shoulder, I could see my mother's favorite chair. Green fabric. Worn at the armrests. Still exactly where she had always kept it. "My name is Elena Whitmore. I am 28 years old, a pediatric nurse from Ohio, and 6 months ago I believed my family was normal. That belief died on my mother's front porch while a locksmith changed the locks and my brother held up a document and strangers carried her furniture past me like I had never lived there at all. I didn't argue on the porch. I want to be honest about that. Could have. Caleb clearly expected me to. He had the posture of someone braced for a scene, feet slightly apart, document still raised, watching me with the careful attention of a person who has a response prepared for whatever comes next. I looked at him for a long moment. Then I picked up my bag, gathered the clothes from the wet concrete, and walked to my car. I sat in the driver's seat with the rain coming down and my hands in my lap, and I tried to understand what had just happened. Not the surface of it. The structure. Because something about the way it had unfolded didn't feel like grief turning into a bad decision. It felt deliberate. The locksmith had been called in advance. The document had been prepared in advance. Caleb had known exactly what he was going to say before I arrived. This had been planned. My aunt tapped on the passenger window. I unlocked it and she got in, soaking and shaken, and she sat beside me without speaking for a while. "He showed them a will," she finally said. "Before the service. He showed 3 relatives this morning before we even got to the church. Before the service." I stared at the windscreen. "He briefed them before Mom was even in the ground," I said. She nodded slowly. "Elena, something isn't right." Already knew. But hearing someone else say it out loud turned the knowledge into something I could act on rather than simply carry. I started the engine. I had nowhere specific to go. I drove anyway because moving felt better than staying still in front of a house where someone had just changed the locks. "My name is Elena Whitmore. I am 28 years old. I want to tell you who I was before this because the story only makes sense if you understand the person who walked onto that porch. I was the practical one. The daughter who drove home on weekends when my mother's health started declining. Who learned which medications she needed and in what order and what time. Who called the insurance company and stayed on hold for 40 minutes to sort out the coverage dispute over her second hospitalization. Who cleaned the kitchen and changed the bed sheets and sat beside her through the treatment appointments that made her too tired to speak. I was not perfect, but I was present. Consistently, unglamorously, quietly present. Caleb lived 2 states away. He visited at Christmas and sometimes Easter, and when he called, the conversations were short and purposeful. He was not unkind to her. He just wasn't there. And yet somehow, standing on that porch with a document I hadn't seen and a locksmith I hadn't been told about, he had become the person who owned everything. The will, if it was genuine, said the house was his. The will, if it was genuine, left me a small bank account and a storage unit of personal items. A woman I had sat beside through chemotherapy appointments and medication schedules and 6 in the morning phone calls had apparently left her house to the son who spent most of her final year 2 states away. I drove until the rain stopped, and then I pulled over and sat very still and thought about the phrase if it was genuine. I had met our family's estate solicitor twice before. The first time was when my parents updated their documents after my father died, 12 years earlier. The second time was when my mother added a medical directive 2 years ago, which I had accompanied her to because she asked me to come. His name was Mr. Adeyemi. He had an office above a dry cleaner on the main road into town, and he kept a small cactus on his window ledge that had been there both times I visited. I called his office the morning after the funeral. His assistant answered, and I gave my name and asked to speak with him about my mother's estate. There was a pause that lasted slightly longer than a simple hold. When Mr. Adeyemi came on the line, his voice was careful in a way that I recognized immediately. It was the voice of a professional who has information they need to share but haven't yet decided how. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "I was expecting to hear from you." "Caleb presented a will," I said. "At the house. Yesterday." Another pause. "Yes," he said. "He contacted my office 3 weeks ago about an update to your mother's documents." 3 weeks ago. My mother had died 11 days ago. "Mr. Adeyemi," I said carefully, "my mother was in hospice care 3 weeks ago." The silence on the line was long enough to confirm what I was already thinking. "I think," he said slowly, "that you should come in. My aunt let me sleep on her sofa that night and the night after. She didn't push me to talk, which I appreciated. She made food I barely ate and left the television on at a low volume and checked on me once in the morning without making it into a moment. She was my mother's older sister, and she had the same quiet practicality, which in those first 2 days was the only thing I could be around without feeling like I was going to collapse. The family had split along lines I didn't fully understand yet. 3 cousins had called to say they were sorry about how things had gone at the house, which meant they had witnessed the porch and found it wrong but weren't prepared to say so publicly. 2 uncles had already aligned with Caleb. I found this out through my aunt, who had received careful messages from both of them suggesting I respect my mother's wishes. They had accepted the document without question, the way people accept explanations from confident sources when the alternative is uncomfortable. Caleb's wife Petra had posted something on social media about honoring a mother's legacy. She hadn't named me. She hadn't needed to. I lay on my aunt's sofa in the dark on the second night and understood something important about what I was facing. This wasn't only a legal dispute. It was a narrative war. And Caleb had started weeks before I even knew there was a conflict. Mr. Adeyemi's office smelled exactly as I remembered. The cactus was still on the window ledge. He closed the door and sat across from me and began speaking in the way of a man who has decided that directness serves everyone better than careful management. The will Caleb had presented was dated 6 weeks before my mother's death. It was properly formatted and it bore my mother's signature, and it had been witnessed and notarized. On its face it was legitimate. But Mr. Adeyemi had a problem with it. 3 months before that will was signed, he had met with my mother alone. She had come in to update her medical directive, but before she left she had asked him a question that he had written down because it unsettled him at the time. She had asked what would happen if someone pressured a person into signing a document while they were very ill. He had answered in general terms about undue influence and capacity assessments. She had thanked him and left. He had noted it in her file and done nothing further because she had not asked him to take action. "I thought about calling her," he said. "I should have called her." I looked at the notepad on his desk where he had written the date of that conversation. 3 months before a will appeared that gave everything to Caleb. What would I need to show, I asked, to challenge it? He folded his hands. Evidence that her capacity was compromised, or that she was under undue influence when she signed it. He paused. Or both. I asked what that evidence would look like. He told me. I started thinking about where to find it. I went back to my mother's medical records first. As her primary caregiver, I had been involved in most of her appointments during the final year. I had access to the summary notes from her treatment team, and I understood enough about her illness to read them with some accuracy. 6 weeks before her death, The date on the will. My mother had been in the second week of a new medication adjustment. The hospice team had been managing significant cognitive effects. I had been told by the attending nurse during a visit that week that my mother was having good days and difficult days. On difficult days, she became confused about time and names and the sequence of events. I contacted the hospice center and made a formal request for her detailed clinical notes from that week. Then I called the notary whose stamp appeared on the will. He was professional and courteous and said he could not discuss specific clients. But I asked him one question that he paused on slightly too long before giving a non-answer. I asked whether he had any mechanism for assessing capacity during signings involving patients in active hospice care. He said that was a matter for the solicitor overseeing the document, which told me that nobody had specifically asked him to assess it. I wrote everything down in a notebook I had bought for exactly this purpose and kept it in my bag. Caleb called me on a Thursday afternoon. I had been expecting the call. I had prepared for it the way I prepared for difficult conversations at work, by deciding in advance what I was willing to say and what I was keeping to myself. He opened with a tone I had heard from him my whole life. Reasonable. Slightly impatient. The tone of someone who expects to be believed and has been given enough evidence that this expectation is usually correct. I know this is hard, he said. Losing her. It's hard for both of us. I said nothing. Mom made her wishes clear, he continued. I know it's not what you expected, but she wanted me to take care of the house. She told me directly. When? Yes. Half pause. Over the last few months. We talked a lot. When you visited. Yes. He had visited twice in the final year. I had the records of both visits in my memory because I had arranged the first one and been present for the second. We talked on the phone, he said. I'd like to see the will myself, I said. His tone adjusted slightly. You'll get copies through the proper process. I'd like to see it now, I said. Elena. Don't make this into something it isn't. I thanked him for calling and ended the conversation. Then I wrote down every word he had said and added it to the notebook. Caleb's wife Petra was a more interesting problem than Caleb. I say interesting because she was more careful than he was. Her social media posts were calibrated. Her conversations with relatives were measured. She never said anything directly that could be read as hostile to me. But the effect of everything she did was the steady reinforcement of Caleb's narrative. She had organized a small gathering at the house on the Saturday after the funeral. She called it a family get-together to honor their mother. She had invited people who I was not close to. She had shown them the house, apparently, and talked about plans for the garden. My cousin Felix told me this because Felix had attended and felt uncomfortable enough to call me afterward. She's acting like they already live there, he said. They didn't live there. Caleb's job was in a different state. Their house was there. Which raised a question I hadn't thought to ask yet. If Caleb genuinely intended to keep the house, he would need to either relocate or rent it out. If he was planning to sell it, using the will as the instrument to take ownership and then convert it to cash, then the entire plan had a financial logic that the emotional framing of honoring their mother was designed to obscure. I called a property analyst I knew through a colleague and asked what the house on my mother's street would currently sell for. The number was considerably higher than I had expected. The hospice clinical notes arrived by secure post on a Tuesday. I read them at my aunt's kitchen table with a cup of tea going cold beside me and a pen in my hand for marking relevant sections. The week the will was signed, my mother had been assessed twice by the hospice team as experiencing moderate cognitive fluctuation. The notes used clinical language, but the meaning was clear. She was having periods of confusion significant enough to be documented. Her capacity to make complex decisions during those periods was described as limited. One nurse's note from 2 days before the will signing recorded that my mother had asked 3 times in one afternoon where her daughter was. She had used my name specifically. I sat with that entry for a long time. She had been asking for me. 2 days before she signed a document that gave the house to Caleb. 2 days before she apparently told him she wanted him to take care of everything. I made a list of the hospice staff members named in the notes. Then I wrote to two of them directly, identifying myself as her daughter and the person who had been her primary caregiver, and asking if they would be willing to speak with me about her condition during that final month. Both of them replied within 48 hours. Neither of them had been told that a will had been signed during the week their notes described. Both of them had clear memories of that period. Neither of their memories matched the version Caleb had presented. Mr. Adeyemi had told me that challenging a will required either capacity evidence or undue influence evidence, or both. I was building the capacity case through the clinical notes and the hospice staff. But undue influence was harder. It required showing not just that my mother was vulnerable but that someone had used that vulnerability deliberately. I started going further back. I pulled my own records of the final year. Text messages, emails, phone calls. Every communication where my mother had mentioned Caleb, the house, or any conversation about what would happen after she died. In February, 4 months before she died, she had sent me a text I had read at the time as a passing thought. She had written, "Caleb keeps asking about the house. I told him I haven't decided anything yet." I had replied with something reassuring and moved on. In March, she had called me sounding tired and slightly distracted, and mentioned that Caleb had been calling more frequently. She had said she found it tiring. I had taken it as grief-adjacent anxiety. The adult child who lived far away suddenly wanting connection as a parent declined. In April, the last month before the hospice admission, she had said something I had only half registered at the time. She had said, "I hope I don't say something I don't mean." I had asked her what she meant and she had changed the subject. Standing in my aunt's kitchen reading through those old messages, the progression built itself into something with a shape I couldn't ignore. She had been resistant to Caleb's pressure in February. She had found it tiring by March. She had expressed a fear about her own decision-making in April. And in the second week of hospice care, on a day when she had been documented as cognitively impaired, a will had appeared with her signature on it. I told my aunt what I had found. We sat at the kitchen table with the documents spread between us and I walked her through the timeline. She listened carefully and didn't interrupt. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. Then she told me something she had been holding since the funeral. In the last month of my mother's life, my aunt had visited the hospice twice. On the first visit, my mother had been clearly herself, tired but present and sharp. On the second visit, 2 weeks later, something had been different. My mother had taken her hand and said very quietly, "Don't let him take Elena's part." My aunt had thought she meant a part of the funeral arrangements. She had assured her everything would be handled properly and moved the conversation on. She had been carrying that sentence since the funeral without fully understanding it. Till now. I wrote it down in the notebook. Then I called Mr. Adeyemi and told him I had the clinical notes, 2 hospice staff willing to speak, a documented pattern of pressure, and an eyewitness account of my mother expressing concern about my inheritance 2 weeks before she died. He was quiet for a moment. "That," he said carefully, "is the beginning of a strong case." Caleb served me with a formal notice through his solicitor the following week. The notice informed me that my challenge to the will was noted and would be contested. It included a list of witnesses Caleb's team planned to call. 6 names. 2 were relatives who had attended the Saturday gathering at the house. 2 were people I didn't recognize. 1 was Petra. The 6th name was a doctor. Not my mother's hospice physician. A private physician I had never encountered in any of my mother's care records. I had no record of my mother ever being seen by this person. I brought the name to Mr. Adeyemi immediately. He searched the medical register. The doctor was legitimate. But the listed address was in the same town where Caleb lived, not in our town. And there was no referral in any of my mother's hospice notes that indicated she had sought a second opinion or been referred externally. Mr. Adeyemi sat back in his chair and looked at me steadily. "They have a doctor willing to testify that she had capacity," he said. "And we have hospice staff documentation suggesting she didn't during that specific window." He nodded. "We need to find out when this doctor saw her," I said. "And how?" Mr. Adeyemi reached for his pen. "I'll file a disclosure request," he said. "If there's a medical file, we're entitled to see the dates and context." We had 10 days before the preliminary hearing. The hospice nurse who called me was named Constance. She had been one of the two who replied to my initial message, and she had been part of my mother's care team during the relevant week. She was measured and professional on the phone. She said she had spoken with her clinical supervisor before calling me and had been told she could discuss the records she had personally documented. She confirmed what the notes showed. My mother had experienced significant periods of confusion during the week the will was signed. She had been medicated for pain management at levels that were known to affect cognitive clarity. The hospice team had documented this because it was clinically relevant. Then she told me something that was not in the notes. She said that a man had come to the hospice during that week and sat with my mother for an extended visit. He had not been on the approved visitor list. The receptionist had let him in because he arrived with flowers and gave my mother's name and said he was her son. She said the visit had lasted approximately 2 hours. She said when she did the next check after he left, my mother was distressed. She said she had noted the distress in her personal observation log, but it had not been formally escalated because her mother had settled by the time the next assessment occurred. I asked if she still had the observation log. She said she did and that she was willing to share it through the appropriate legal channels. I called Mr. Adeyemi before I had even put the phone down. The preliminary hearing was on a Wednesday morning. Caleb arrived with 2 solicitors. I arrived with Mr. Adeyemi and a folder containing the clinical notes, Constance's observation log, my aunt's written statement, the text message records, and the disclosure request results that had come through 2 days earlier. The disclosure had confirmed that the private doctor Caleb planned to call had assessed my mother on a single date. That date was the same day as the hospice visit Constance had logged. The same day Caleb had sat with her for 2 hours. The same day she had been distressed afterward. The judge reviewing the preliminary matter was not yet hearing the full case. She was deciding whether the challenge had sufficient grounds to proceed to a full hearing. Caleb's team presented the will as valid and straightforward. They presented his witness list with confidence. Mr. Adeyemi presented our material quietly and methodically. When the judge saw the overlap between the date of the private assessment and the date of the undisclosed hospice visit and the documented cognitive state of my mother during that period, she looked up from the papers. She asked Caleb's solicitor to explain how a private medical assessment had been arranged for a hospice patient without the knowledge of her primary care team or her primary next-of-kin caregiver. The solicitor said they would need time to respond fully. The judge granted the full hearing. She also issued a preservation order preventing any sale or transfer of the property until the matter was resolved. In the corridor afterward, I saw Caleb for the first time since the porch. He looked at me, and for the first time there was no document in his hand. Something shifted after the preservation order was issued. Caleb had been moving with a particular kind of confidence since the porch. The confidence of someone who believes the outcome is settled, and they are simply completing steps in a predetermined sequence. The order interrupted that. It introduced the possibility that he might not finish where he intended, and I watched the effect of that possibility move through his behavior over the following weeks. He called 2 relatives who had previously been neutral and had conversations about my state of mind. He contacted my employer, a children's hospital where I had worked for 4 years, through an indirect channel, suggesting to a mutual acquaintance that I had been struggling since the bereavement. I found this out through a colleague who thought I should know and told me directly. He was trying to discredit me the same way he had tried before I even knew the conflict had started, building a version of me that would make a court less inclined to trust my account. But this time I was watching. This time I wrote everything down. Every contact, every indirect approach, every effort to shape the narrative around me. And I kept doing something he seemed not to have expected. I stayed calm. I went to work. Cared for my patients. I maintained every professional and personal relationship I had. I gave him nothing to point at. A person acting unstably is visible. A person who quietly builds a legal case while living their ordinary life is much harder to dismiss. My cousin Felix came to see me on a Sunday evening without calling ahead. He sat at my aunt's kitchen table and looked uncomfortable for about 3 minutes before he said what he had come to say. At the Saturday gathering Petra had organized at the house, he had overheard a conversation that he had been turning over ever since. Caleb and Petra had been standing in the kitchen talking while Felix was in the hallway. He had heard Caleb say that the sale needed to happen before the legal situation dragged out too long. He had heard Petra respond that the agent had already been contacted. The agent had already been contacted. Before the preservation order. Before the preliminary hearing. Before the full case had been scheduled. Caleb had been moving toward a sale simultaneously with presenting himself in court as simply honoring his mother's wishes. Felix gave me his written account that evening, signed and dated. I added it to the folder. Then I contacted the preservation order compliance officer and reported that evidence suggested the respondent had made preliminary approaches to a property agent prior to the order being issued. This was relevant to how seriously any subsequent sale attempts would be treated. I also asked Mr. Adeyemi whether approaching an agent while a dispute was active could affect the court's view of Caleb's conduct and motivations. Materially, he said simply. The full hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks out. In those 6 weeks, I did something I had not done since the porch. I went back to the house. Not inside. I stood on the pavement across the street in the early morning while the neighborhood was still quiet, and I looked at it. The curtains were different. Petra had changed the curtains my mother had hung in the front room. The pale yellow ones she had chosen herself 7 years ago after spending 2 Saturdays looking at fabric samples. I stood there for long enough to feel everything the sight produced. The grief of it and the anger and the specific sadness of seeing a space your mother built to her own preferences quietly repainted by someone who arrived 3 hours after the funeral. Then I turned around and went home. Because the time I spent standing on the pavement was the time I was allowed for feeling it. Everything after that was for building. I spent the 6 weeks before the hearing reviewing every document until I could find my way through them without notes. I prepared for the questions Caleb's team would ask me. I worked with Mr. Adeyemi on the clearest possible presentation of the timeline. I was not performing recovery. I was actually doing it, which turned out to feel different from the inside than I expected. Caleb's arrogance, meanwhile, was making his preparations sloppy. Felix told me he had been telling relatives the legal challenge was a formality and would be dismissed within a week of the hearing. He believed he had already won. 2 weeks before the full hearing, Caleb made an error. He contacted the estate solicitor directly, not through his own legal team, but personally by phone, and asked Mr. Adeyemi to confirm that no additional documents related to the estate existed outside the will he had filed. Mr. Adeyemi told me about the call immediately. The call itself was irregular. A party in active litigation contacting the opposing side's solicitor directly, and asking them to confirm the absence of documents was the kind of thing that people did when they were worried a document existed and hoping it didn't. Mr. Adeyemi had responded that he could not confirm or deny the contents of the file to a party represented by their own counsel and had ended the call. But the call told me something specific. Caleb was worried about what was in Mr. Adeyemi's file, which meant he suspected there was something there. I asked Mr. Adeyemi directly. Was there something in the file he hadn't yet shown me? He was quiet for a moment. Then he told me that my mother had visited his office alone, not for the medical directive appointment I had attended, but for a separate appointment 1 month before she was admitted to hospice. He had not raised it earlier because he had been uncertain of its relevance. During that appointment she had given him something. He opened the lower drawer of his filing cabinet and placed an envelope on the desk in front of me. The envelope had my name on the front in my mother's handwriting. Mr. Adeyemi explained that she had given it to him with specific instructions. He was to retain it as part of the estate file. He was not to share it with anyone except me, and only in the context of a formal estate proceeding. He was to treat it as a protected document. She had known. She had suspected what Caleb might do, and she had prepared a countermeasure and placed it with the one person who had the legal obligation to protect it. I opened it carefully. Inside was a 2-page handwritten letter. My mother's handwriting, steady and clear. This had been written before the hospice admission, before the medication adjustments, before the cognitive fluctuations. Her voice was entirely present in every line. She wrote that she was leaving the letter because she had become concerned about pressure she was experiencing from Caleb regarding the house. She wrote that she wanted the record to show her true intentions. She wrote that she had always intended to leave the house to me because I had been her primary support through her illness, and because I had contributed financially to its maintenance for 3 years. She wrote that if a will existed which said otherwise, she wanted it known that she had never willingly agreed to such an arrangement, and that she had made the appointment specifically to create an official record of her real wishes. At the bottom of the 2nd page, she had written a single sentence that I read 3 times before I could put the letter down. Elena always came. Remember that. The day before the full hearing, Caleb's team filed a supplementary submission. I read it with Mr. Adeyemi at his desk and felt something drop in my chest. They had obtained a second witness statement from a family friend who had visited my mother 6 weeks before her death, the same week as the will. The statement described my mother as clear, conversational, and fully engaged during the visit. It described a specific conversation about the house in which my mother had apparently said she had decided Caleb should be responsible for it. It was a new statement, not something that had been filed at the preliminary stage. Mr. Adeyemi believed it was genuine but possibly selective. People in moderate cognitive decline have good periods within difficult weeks. A single positive visit during a week that also contained documented confusion was not impossible. It was not proof of consistent capacity, but it was effective. The submission was well-timed. Less than 24 hours before the hearing, it reintroduced doubt. I didn't sleep well that night. I sat with the envelope for a long time. My mother's letter, her handwriting, the appointment she had made alone without telling anyone, because she was afraid of what was coming and wanted to leave a record. I thought about her asking the hospice nurse where I was. I thought about what she had said to my aunt. Don't let him take Elena's part. And in the morning, I put the letter back in the envelope and carried it to court. Caleb arrived at the hearing looking like a man who had decided the supplementary submission had turned the tide. He sat at his table with a relaxed quality that hadn't been there at the preliminary stage. He spoke quietly to his solicitors without the tension of the previous hearing. When I walked in, he looked at me briefly and then away, the look of someone who has calculated the odds and found them satisfactory. Petra was in the gallery. She was dressed as if for a significant occasion. The hearing began with Caleb's team presenting first. They were thorough. The will properly formatted. The notarist's signature. The private doctor's assessment confirming capacity on the relevant date. The new witness statement describing my mother as clear and conversational. They presented it as a straightforward case. A valid will, properly executed, being challenged by a disappointed beneficiary. I sat and listened and kept my hands still. Then Caleb himself gave a statement. He described his relationship with his mother as close. He described their phone conversations as frequent and meaningful. He described the decision about the house as one she had come to gradually and communicated to him clearly. He spoke about his intentions for the property, how he planned to maintain it, possibly eventually move back to the area, preserve what their mother had built. He sounded believable, measured and sad and sincere. The room had a quality that told me some people in it were persuaded. Then Mr. Adeyemi stood up. Mr. Adeyemi placed the envelope on the table first. He explained its provenance clearly and completely. The appointment my mother had made alone, 1 month before her hospice admission. The instructions she had given regarding its retention and release. The chain of custody showing it had sat untouched in a protected estate file from that appointment until this morning. He read the letter aloud. The room was very quiet while he read. When he reached the paragraph about the pressure she had been experiencing from Caleb regarding the house, I heard Petra shift in her seat in the gallery. When he read the line about her true intentions, that she had always meant to leave the house to me, Caleb's solicitor put his pen down. When Mr. Adeyemi read the final sentence, Elena always came. Remember that, the judge looked up from her notes. Then Mr. Adeyemi presented everything else. The clinical documentation. Constance's observation log. The overlap between the private doctor's assessment and Caleb's undisclosed hospice visit. The text messages showing a pattern of escalating pressure from February through April. My aunt's statement. Felix's account of the conversation about the property agent. He laid each piece down in order without drama, like someone building a structure that was simply going to stand. Caleb's solicitor asked for a recess. The judge granted 15 minutes. When the hearing resumed, something had changed on the other side of the room. The recess had done something to Caleb's posture that the entire preceding hour had not managed. The relaxed quality was gone. He sat forward now with his arms close to his body, and when his solicitor spoke, the measured confidence was replaced by something more careful and retreat-oriented. They challenged the letters standing. Mr. Adeyemi had anticipated this, and his response was clean and fully documented. The letter had been formally retained as a protected estate document by a regulated solicitor under explicit client instruction. Its legal standing was sound. They challenged the clinical notes as incomplete. The judge noted that the documentation covered a specific and relevant period, and was corroborated by the independent observation log. They challenged the undisclosed hospice visit as unconfirmed. Mr. Adeyemi produced the hospice reception register showing Caleb signed in on the relevant date. At this point, Caleb's solicitor requested a private conference. The judge declined. What happened next was not dramatic. There was no single moment of collapse. It was more like watching something lose its structural integrity slowly and then settle. Caleb's responses to the judge's questions became shorter. His solicitor's framing became more defensive and less assertive. The private doctor's testimony, reviewed against the clinical notes and the registration date, developed gaps that neither of them could fully close. The judge asked Caleb directly in plain language to explain the undisclosed visit. He said he had gone to see his mother. She asked whether he had made any arrangements during or after that visit in relation to her legal documents. He said he had simply wanted to spend time with her. She looked at him for a long moment without writing anything. The ruling came the following morning. I sat in Mr. Adeyemi's office and listened while he read it aloud, because I had asked him to do it that way. I wanted to hear the words rather than read them alone. The will was found to have been executed under circumstances that raised substantive concerns about capacity and undue influence. The clinical documentation, the protected estate letter, the witness evidence, and the procedural irregularities surrounding the private medical assessment collectively formed sufficient grounds to set aside the instrument. The estate would revert to the prior documented intentions of my mother, which included the letter she had left with Mr. Adeyemi and the original beneficiary designations from the earlier will, which had never been formally revoked through proper process. The house was mine. I sat with that for a moment and let it be what it was. Not triumph exactly. Something quieter. The particular feeling of a truth that has been distorted for months finally being confirmed in official language. Then I drove to the house on my mother's street. I had the key Mr. Adeyemi had given me after the ruling. I walked up the path and put it in the lock and opened the door. The curtains Petra had hung were still there. I would change them. I would find fabric close to the pale yellow ones my mother had chosen, and I would rehang them on the same rail. The green chair was still in the corner. Nobody had moved it.